Hi, I'm Gabby and welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of the Happier Life Project podcast, brought to you by the free award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. We're so excited to have you back with us as we kick off another season dedicated to exploring ways to live a healthier, happier life, helping you on your mental health journey. And today we're diving into a topic that's both powerful and transformative: the importance of owning and sharing our personal stories. Whether it's about mental illness, trauma, or any life-changing experience, sharing your story with a trusted friend or loved one can lead to incredible emotional release and a deep sense of relief. It reinforces feelings of strength, resilience, and perseverance. And overall, it's an incredibly cathartic experience. Owning your story is one of the most powerful tools in combating its stigma and shame. We all have a story, and when we share it, we help ourselves make sense of our experiences, processing the emotions attached to it, and ultimately making peace with our past. This concept is especially important when we talk about self-therapy and learning how to be your own therapist. As today's guest, best-selling author, former NHS clinical lead for mental health and psychotherapist Owen O'Kane will tell us, understanding, acknowledging and making peace with our story is the essential first step. With long waiting lists for therapy on the NHS and the cost of private therapy being out of reach for many, therapy often feels like a luxury rather than a necessity. But in Owen's book, How to Be Your Own Therapist, Boost Your Mood and Reduce Your Anxiety in 10 minutes a day, Owen outlines practical strategies that can help you take control of your mental health, whether you are or aren't also working with a professional. Owen highlights 4 key areas where many of us struggle. They are a lack of self-worth, not feeling safe or secure, a sense of hopelessness, and questioning our lovability. Whether you struggle with 1, 2, or all 4 of these areas, there's no denying their impact on our mental health. But the good news is, in How to Be Your Own Therapist, Owen reveals short, smart techniques that take just 10 minutes a day to help you develop healthier perspectives and break free from harmful thought patterns. This episode really felt like a full circle moment for me because Owen was actually the first ever guest on this very podcast back when we were named after the app, My Possible Self. It was wonderful to catch up with Owen again, and it felt like no time had passed, even though it had been 3 years. In our conversation, we explore why we often become so attached to our stories and the suffering, and importantly, how we can start to let go. Owen also shares valuable insights on how to access the therapist within yourself. Not to replace professional help, but to add effective techniques to your toolkit for when life's stresses, worries, or unhelpful thoughts start to pull you down. So, with that in mind, are you ready to find a healthier, happier you? Let's get started. Owen O'Kane, it is absolutely lovely to see you again, and thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Very welcome. Delighted to talk to you again.
I couldn't help but reflect, actually, once we were confirmed, because you were one of the first guests that I recorded with when we started, and that was 3 years ago.
Wow.
And season 1, we called after the app, My Possible Self, and since then we've rebranded to the Happier Life Project.
Wow.
To make it a little bit more accessible, because we kind of covered in season 1 a lot of the more clinical mental health issues, problems. I never know quite how to coin it whilst being sensitive, but struggles.
Humanity. Do you know what I do? I call it humanity.
There you go.
Yeah, our humanity, because I'm really strong in this these days because I think that, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this.
Yeah.
I think the conversations got really confused. I've been working in physical and mental health most of my career, which spans over about 30 years now. But I think the one thing that we constantly forget about and stuff that we see online and documentaries and everything, this is a conversation about being human.
You're so right.
We just need to really start moving away from the over pathologizing people and labeling people. Now, don't get me wrong, there are times when I think a diagnosis is important because somebody might need the right treatment and the right medication and a plan. So there are times that that's very, very important. But I can't help but feel that we've just moved into this diagnosis essential where everybody wants to be fitted into some sort of diagnosis, when I think actually, to be a human being is sometimes to struggle. There'll be ups and downs, highs and lows, anxious moments, moments of overwhelm, moments when mood might dip, moments of feeling a bit lost. That is part of being a human being.
Yeah.
And I think if we sort of started to categorize that as abnormal and a problem, then I think we create a culture that's unhelpful. So I'm constantly now more and more and more just talking about the humanity of our struggle.
Well, there's our fantastic soundbite for the start of the podcast. No, because it's completely aligned with what we've been talking about at My Possible Self, and why we rebranded the name to the Happier Life Project podcast was because, like you so eloquently summarized, like we all struggle. And I think this is actually ringing a bell when we talked 3 years ago about
Probably, this. I've been banging on about it for years.
No, this about labels, because labels and how we can be easy to brand ourselves as I've got ADHD without, seeing a professional about it because they've read a few things or Googled a few things.
Yeah.
Not saying that frivolously, but, it's like, I've got OCD because they like to keep it clean. So we are a bit too quick to maybe want to put ourselves in some kind of bracket or category.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the big problem is because a lot of the diagnosis and terms are just kind of been bandied around quite frequently now. I guess there have been people who have been campaigning for years for mental health rights and to support people with different diagnoses and challenges. And I think that if we start to dilute the conversation too much, where it's just like everyone's talking about having mental health. Now, there's a degree of truth about that, because to be a human being is we all have mental health. We have a brain. So that means, of course, that brain sometimes may not function the way we need it to.
Yeah.
The other side of the coin is that if we start to just, like I was saying earlier, if we over pathologize everything, I think we dilute some of the campaigning that's gone on for years. And then suddenly people, I'll give you a really good example. I was talking to someone recently, and they know what I do for a living, and they know that I do talks and write books and have been a clinician for many years. And they were really polite about it, and they weren't meaning to be offensive. And they said, look, if I'm being really honest, I'm just sick hearing about people talking about their mental health. I'm just a bit worn down by the conversation, and I'm just tired of everyone, attributing whatever's going on in their life to mental health. And I hear this with employers as well. Now, look, I don't entirely agree with that, because I think, look, it's a bigger conversation than that. But at the same time, I think we do have to really think about how the conversation unfolds, because there is real strength in people speaking out and getting support and being advocates, 100% behind all of that. But I think if we then start to call every single thing mental health, I just kind of think it's dangerous territory.
Yeah, I'm with you there for sure. And I was going to ask you, over the last 3 years, I'm still going to ask it. I'm laughing now after your last response, but have we gotten any better at talking about mental health, do you think?
Look, there are some great things happening. There really are. There are some great things that are happening. There's some good campaigns. There are many people doing great work. There's a culture now where it is much easier for people to have conversations, so I think that is the upside. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest here, and this may not be a popular opinion with some people, but I guess my work takes me in different directions. So some days I'm with clients, working with them individually. Other times I can be doing corporate gigs where I'm talking to a lot of people. or sometimes I'll go into organizations and I'll be working with the senior managers or I'll be off at a festival. So I guess really I have the privilege of being able to hear the conversation at many different levels and in
Mhm.
many different arenas. And I think part of the challenge might be, for example, for employers is that a lot of employers are really struggling to differentiate. I often go in and they'll say to me, can you
Yeah.
help me differentiate what is
Yeah.
a genuine mental health problem or
Yeah.
disorder? Now, I don't like the word disorder. No one's
Hmm.
disordered, but I mean, if you were talking clinically, can you
Mm.
help us differentiate the difference between that and someone
Yeah.
who's having a bad day? Because I hear a lot of HR departments struggling with this concept of not knowing how to support people because they're not able to differentiate between what the level of need is. And
Mm.
how do you break that down? And how do you support somebody who just might be having a tough day or need a bit more support, or
Yeah.
as opposed to somebody who might need a more specific intervention? And I guess really, I think when I said earlier about the conversation becoming a bit more complicated, I think it's merged into many areas. I
Mm.
also think it's worth saying, and again, this may not be a popular opinion, that, look, I've been working in this arena for a long time. It's my bread and butter. It's my work. It's what I do. It's kind of something before this became topical or important or an Instagram, trend or whatever you want to
Hashtag.
call it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, all of
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. I also am very, very mindful as well that there's just a lot of commercial value
Mm.
around well-being the
Yeah.
minute. And that's something I really struggle with as a clinician and someone who's worked in the area for a long time because this is not, mental health is not a commercial opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
It is about reaching out to support people and help them reshape their lives and actually just try to ease human suffering for people. I mean, that for me, that's what the conversation
Mm.
is about. That's not to say that people have to make a living and do a job. That's a totally different conversation. But
Mm.
I kind of think there's something about the entire wellness industry at the minute, and particularly when it comes to this aspect of wellness, where I feel strongly that it's not a means of
Yeah.
seeking a commercial opportunity.
Well, I think the lines have been so blurred now as well because life just maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I feel like life is just keeps getting tougher and tougher in maybe personally, sure, but I'm zooming out globally or within our communities. Like it's just like not that, another bill's coming. It's all these layers of things coming up that just make you kind of shrink and shrink and shrink or just
Yeah.
however you react. And then you're like, oh, I've got a mental health problem because I'm, extremely sad or depressed or whatever. And it's like, it's probably very justified. And to bring it into, I guess, the work we do to an extent, but certainly your book, How to Be Your Own Therapist, it's
Yeah.
maybe helping with those blurred lines by giving you some simple tools, 10 minutes a day to build your resilience up, I suppose, and maybe go outward a little bit rather because it can just all feel sometimes just too much, can't it? Like,
I think so. And, I talked, I mean, it's interesting because the book's been out for a while now.
mm,
And the motivation behind that book was genuinely that, wait lists, as we know, are astronomically high.
yeah,
That they're not good. Putting somebody on a course while they're waiting for treatment doesn't qualify as a treatment,
mm,
but yet it will take them off a wait list. So I think we have to be realistic about wait lists. Actually, there are a lot of people waiting for direct individual interventions or even a group intervention that might support them. There are a lot of people. Now, don't get me wrong. I worked for the NHS a big part of my career. They're doing a brilliant job trying to see as many people as possible with limited resources. So it's not a criticism at all of the
mm,
NHS who are stretched to the limit. But I do think that there are a lot of people out there waiting for help and support. I think there are a lot of people out there who just don't know where to start with some of this stuff. And I guess
yeah,
my motivation for doing that book was, look, I've kind of seen a lot over the years, and often the interventions that are helpful are way simpler than you realize. And
mm,
I guess what I wanted to share in that book was, most people can get started on the work and do stuff that's really powerful at actually helping them begin to level and
yeah,
quietening the noise in their head and actually starting to feel a degree of motivation again. So what I tried to do in the book was to keep it as simplistic as possible, but at the same time, I give people picking it up hope really that actually you can get started on this stuff today.
Yeah. Well, when I was reading it, I was kind of doing it along. You can't help but, I mean, a big aha moment for me was you talk about tone, the tone of voice, your tone of voice when you're talking
Or
to
yourself.
yourself. And then you sort of reframed it as like, would you talk to somebody that matters to you in the same tone? And I was like,
Yeah, I know.
just the way you put that was like a light bulb
I
switch, you
know,
know?
I know. It's interesting actually. It's often the small things. In my own therapy years ago, I mean, we have to have therapy as part of our work, and I think any good therapist should be in their own therapy. It's part of the deal. I think that it should be for all therapy modalities because you're carrying a lot of stuff. So of course you need to be working through your own stuff. But
Yeah.
I can remember years ago, like, and I should know better because I've been doing the job a long time. But it's interesting how we can fall into traps. I remember my own therapist challenging me years back, and I was doing all of the right things, but I was going through this particularly challenging period and feeling a bit overwhelmed and things were a bit difficult. And I was meditating and exercising and eating well and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I said, I just, I don't feel I'm on top of things at the minute. And I feel like I'm doing all of the right things.
Yeah.
And he said to me something really powerful with it. And that, I mean, it was like a bit like what you were saying about that part in the book about tone.
Mm.
He then said to me, so why are you doing all of this stuff? What's the purpose in doing it? And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I'm doing it to feel better. And then he just paused for a second and he said, do you think there's a possibility you're doing all of this stuff because you want to get rid of the feelings? And it was just an immediate, oh my God, talk about someone like nailing it and cornering you where you've got nowhere
Yeah.
else to go. And that was exactly it. That's what was happening. I was doing all of this stuff to try and not feel the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
So it's
As we all
almost
do in our own
counterintuitive.
ways.
So you can, and I think very often that's what happens. We can get involved in all, and I watch people do breathing exercises and meditating, and I think I tell that story in the group about the lady with anxiety, and she's talking to her anxious self, and I said, well, what do you, how are you speaking to that anxious self? And she was like, literally. I mean, I won't say it because I'm not saying what she actually said, but I mean, but she was effing and blinding and screaming at it. And I said, like, if you were talking to another human being that way,
Mm.
would you expect him to respond?
Mm.
So she was like doing these mantras to
Yeah.
try and flatten her anxiety. But when I said, what does it sound like? And when she started to then repeat the mantras and the effing and blinded in between them, it was just, it was everything really,
Yeah, that would make a good like TikTok video. I'm thinking as a bit, but no, it's very serious. But yeah, and a lot of us, I'm sure, do similar things. Just to go back to I guess the synopsis of how to be your own therapist. It's 10 chapters, and it's basically 10 minutes a day. Is the suggestion with the invitation to do longer if you can do longer, but
Yeah, that's the practice side of it. The first half of the book, as you know, is just that whole, good therapy will bring you towards your story and telling your story. And
yeah,
the first half of the book tries to do that, where it, really breaks down, okay, how will your story, regardless of what your story is, how does it help you make sense of who you are today and why you might struggle today? Now, that might sound really simplistic, but it's almost like doing a jigsaw because very often people don't know, why am I anxious? Why am I struggling with mood? Why do I get angry? Why do I get overwhelmed so easily? Why do my relationships break down? Very often people won't go back. So what they'll do is they'll identify the struggle and then beat themselves up because they're struggling. But
Mm.
few people will go back and think, actually, maybe it couldn't be any other way. Maybe your hardwiring was such that this is how it was going to be. Maybe your level of threat was so high during childhood that accompanied you into adulthood. And I kind of think we often forget about the kind of neural hardwiring of the brain, these neural pathways, how we're formed, how we develop. So
Yeah.
the first half tries to get people to say, look, if you can tell your story brutally and honestly, and not the kind of the rehearsed, because we all do it, that we tell the kind of polite version of our story.
Yeah.
So encouraging people to truthfully tell their story, and then when they've told the story, try to break it down and say, how might that help you understand who you are today, why you struggle today? Because in my experience, if you understand why something's happening, then you're more likely to do something about it and you're more likely to break through and succeed.
Mm.
Whereas if you're doing stuff in the dark and you're kind of like, I don't know why I'm doing this, or I don't know why this technique has been used, or why would I do this 10 minutes a day? I think you've got to kind of premise it with, okay, here's the importance. You need to understand who you are, what your story is,
Yeah.
how it shapes who you are today. And then whatever the struggle is, how can you use some of these therapeutic interventions that sometimes can seem quite complicated? How can you use them as just part of your day, really, to almost self-therapy your way through the day?
Yeah. So when we're talking about your story, and I know from going to therapy myself and just also speaking to a lot of therapists, 3 years
You'll
about
be sick listening to them at this stage.
well, or sometimes feeling like a therapist, because I think, I mean, it must be a million times worse for you, Owen, but just saying to somebody that I do a podcast in mental health for a mental health and wellness app, and it's
Yeah.
partnered with the primary healthcare, then people just start to tell me everything that's wrong with them, or they believe is wrong with them. And I'm like, you could try this book. I'm like, I'm not a professional, but this is what I might have learned along the way.
It's a bit like when you meet a GP, and they often say the GPs, they go out for dinner and people start showing them their bunions and their various bits. It is a bit like, I mean, I do think there is that if you mention you're a therapist, and it depends on the context. I mean, we often laugh about it. My other half and I have a running joke. If we go to a dinner party or something, and people are just chit-chatting about what you do. And when it comes to what I do, if I mention that I write books or something, that normally gets a degree of, oh, that's interesting. What do you write about? So it's less threatening. Whereas if I kick off and say I'm a psychotherapist, you might as well say you're a psycho. There's this kind of deadly silence that moves in. And of course, so the one thing everyone will say is, oh, can you read my mind? And I said, no, and I'm not a psychic.
What, Darren Brown?
Exactly. I'm not a psychic. And do you know what I'm thinking? Or are you analysing me now? I mean, if I'm at a dinner party, I can't analyse myself at a dinner party, never mind analyse anyone else. But people go into these notions that you're in work mode all of the time. And of course you're not. I mean, you're a human being.
Yeah. We should say like a landscape gardener or something. Next person.
I drive for a Ocado. I've thought about that one.
Well, yes, I would imagine it, like I said, would be much worse for you. But I will say a nice thing I've discovered when I share what I do is the amount of men that will open up and say things to me that if I told them I was, I don't know, just journalist, say, I wouldn't get that kind of, it's almost like it comes tumbling out before I've even finished the sentence,
Absolutely. And I know I've been joking about, saying what we do and stuff. The real upside to it is very often there is opportunity. Even in social contexts, people might, and sometimes it may not be appropriate there and then to get into a heavy conversation with somebody, but more than often people will drop you a message afterwards or contact you on Instagram or contact you in some way. And at least what you can sometimes do is signpost or direct to the books or podcasts that have been particularly useful. That's the power in this work, really, isn't it? You can hand over a lot of stuff. And direct to some really good content out there. And I kind of think, it's all of I often say that it is all of our responsibilities to kind of hand over what we know. And if something's been useful, then to hand that over to someone else is a good thing, because then they may use it and then hand it over to someone else. And that's the power, isn't it? It's like, the relay race we used to do at school. Do you remember? We just hand over the baton to someone and in the hope actually that you're doing something good.
Yeah, so true. Well, going back to the story part, like identifying our story. I mean, for people that have been on the planet a while, that feels like quite a big thing. Like, how much detail are we, when we're looking at our story to where we are to the present, are we looking for significant sort of character shaping moments, or are we just, are we trying to go through everything? Like,
most people, it'll play out for people in different ways. So most people know the bare basics of their story. They kind of know what their childhood was like. They know what the key moments were. But I think one of two things happen. People know where the difficult areas are or where the tough times are, and they either avoid it and don't want to go near it. When they get to that part of the story, they're like, I just can't go there. So
that's
one of the things
you need to work on.
So when you spot people trying to avoid stuff or trying to railroad through it or just jump over quickly, you normally know that you're on to something. So I point that out, that when you're kind of reflecting back over your story, if you find yourself wanting to fast forward through a period, or you struggle to remember a period, well, then there's probably something in that it might be worth just staying around for a bit. The bottom line is most people, when you're going to their story and you're exploring a bit, people are often a bit terrified about what it's going to uncover.
Yeah.
And very often it's not that, people expect to find something dark. I think often what people find is that their families were imperfect, that their parents were imperfect.
Yeah.
They,
A lot of it does stem from childhood, doesn't it? The
of
things
course
that
it
we
does.
carry.
Yeah, I mean that's where all the kind of the all the proper hardwiring happens in those formative years. And some people might have stuff that was genuinely traumatizing for them that's never been dealt with. So of course that's difficult to go near. Other people might have been from cultures or families where there's really specific rules about how they should be and how they should live. And then they get into adulthood and they realize that those rules don't work for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what then happens is that when I'm working with someone struggling, regardless of who they are, I would say probably in 99.9% of the cases, what I discover is that they're over attached to their story. So if at some point they've been told you're not good enough, you're stupid, you should be better, they're feeling shamed about something, or whatever the context may be, most people cling to that part of the story
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
find it hard to let go of. So very often in everyday life, then what's happening a lot of the time is that the old stuff has been activated,
Mm.
and people find it really hard. So often in therapy, what you find is that people are operating in their everyday life from the old stuff. So they'll tell me a story about, oh, my boss at work really pissed me off and they said this and they said that, and they've interpreted a reaction to what's going on in the workroom. And then when you start to dig deep, you then start to look at the possibility that actually maybe that wasn't
Yeah.
happening, but because they've had an experience that was similar to things that went on in their past, they get activated. So I guess the storytelling is about getting to know
Mm.
those parts of the story. So
Yeah.
you know when you've been triggered and activated and when you're over attaching to the story. Because if you're holding on for dear life to the story and you're staying victimized or trapped or disempowered, then you do become stuck. And I guess how to be your own therapist is about becoming unstuck.
Well, yeah, because another thing that I got from reading it or listening to it, because I got it on Audible, was so I've been listening to your voice a lot recently.
Oh
Owen.
God, you that sounds like torture. Two
Lovely Northern
podcasts and
Irish.
two podcasts, and now you have to listen to my voice as well. That's called
Very nice voice.
glutton for punishment.
Something else that, like, I guess a penny drop moment would be that attaching to these beliefs from childhood, this conditioning, really, isn't it? And without blaming or shaming, but the things that like we might have just picked up and like boys don't cry or good girls don't answer back, just knocking out a couple of cliches there. But then, like you said, you might be triggered at work. Your boss might be basically being a bit of a dick. And it would be appropriate to maybe defend yourself or whatever, but you shush yourself because that's how you've been programmed.
Absolutely.
And then you've got this inner turmoil that just sits in your body and makes you feel crap.
Exactly. And then I guess, you got to remember as well is that a young mind, and certainly in the younger formative years, and even a teenage brain as it's forming and developing, it's still not fully developed. So the kind of adult rational responses that you would expect or you would hope would come to trauma or adversity or rejection or abandonment or attachment issues, you could go on forever about the various childhood issues, but, a child's mind doesn't differentiate between what's good or bad or right or wrong at that stage. All they know is that they're experiencing being told that they're terrible or that they're bad or that they're not good enough. So, our brains are like sponges in the early days. So the human brain is just taking in all of it. It's like a computer program. It's taking in all of this information.
Yeah.
But because in those stages it can't differentiate whether this is true or right or wrong or factual or not, then that's cumulative over the years. And I guess it's only when most people get to adulthood and they, like I meet people sometimes in like later life, maybe in their 70s and they're still really struggling with their identity or confidence and because they're still operating from that. Well, my dad always told me I was rubbish.
Yeah.
I was always told that not to speak, that people wouldn't be interested in what I've got to say. And I can meet people in later years who are, because that was their primal hardwiring and that was never challenged and they believed that to be a truth. So they over attach to the story, then their whole lives have been lived holding on to these values and beliefs that were actually never true, but they
Yeah.
weren't really taught the skill of how do you kind of detach from them and let them go.
Yeah. It seems to be that it's the negative experiences that seem to stick and
That's that.
linger, isn't it? Just why? Why
And
can we
that's
not have the nice one?
it's the nature of the beast, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's how it is. I mean, we because negative experiences tend to obviously they're the ones that tend to cause pain
Mm.
and cause challenges for us that we kind of latch on to them, and a lot of that's fear because we kind of don't want it to happen again. So of course the brain becomes hypervigilant and observant to
Mm.
try and protect that, but it just means that people can end up ruminating. The other side of the coin is that the good experiences too, people can also struggle with them because they're so desperate to hold on to them or for them to happen again that they can almost get lost as well because there's a fear of things not feeling this way forever or how can I recreate that again?
Yeah.
That's so it's
Yeah.
again a struggle. Whereas when I'm working with someone therapeutically, and I hope this comes across in the book, I try and describe it like if you think of a dinner table
Mhm.
and you think of all of the different parts of who we are. Don't think I've used this analogy in the book, but probably should have done. But anyway, we can add it as an extra. If you think of a dinner table, very often, if you think of guests that you would bring to the dinner table, most people would have the parts of themselves that they like and they want the world to see. If someone likes their appearance, they would want that part of the table.
Yeah.
They would want their confident self at the table. They would want their successful self at the table. They would want their look at my job, look what I do self at the table. So the
Their
all of
Instagram profile.
their Instagram profile would
Table.
be at the table, all of that stuff. So
Yeah.
the stuff that it either gets validated, gets liked, appears well to others, seems like it will help with some degree of acceptance. People tend to be okay, or experiences that were like, oh my God, I've just achieved X, Y, and Z. So the human, and this is kind of media and programming and the general message. I mean, if you think of the Olympics, I've got really such strong views about this here. All of the energy is on the winners.
Hmm.
You can argue like, okay, well, it's great for people to achieve and succeed, and I'm all for that. And of course, it's amazing that people reach a level of excellence, in their field and they work hard and they're disciplined and all of that. So I'm all behind that. But I think all of the conversations, all of the energy, all of the focus is on the winners. And I kind of think that for me is not a healthy message to any of us, but particularly to younger generations, that it's all got to be about winning.
God, yeah, you're right. And that there goes the conditioning again, you know?
There goes the conditioning again that, unless it's a gold, or you might be okay with a silver, but it just kind of almost like people have done accept even getting there as an achievement in itself. But
Mm.
it's kind of almost like the focus goes to the top tier.
Yeah.
And it's like but that's one measure. It's not the entire measure of all of these things. So I guess really going back to my table analogy,
Yeah.
we're also made up. Everyone, we have these other parts. So there might be a part that's self-doubting. There might be a part that's sad. There might be a part that's anxious. There might be a part that is unhappy or lonely or isolated. So my argument when I'm working with people is that every part of self gets an equal place at the table. And there's no better, there's no worse, there's no good, there's no bad, that all of these parts of self that we all have
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
invited around the table and we integrate all of them so that actually it's a much more rounded way of living because the parts that we call negative parts, so that I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling
Mm.
anxious, they're often termed, even in some of the best books, are termed as negative emotions. Now,
Yeah.
if I'm talking about negative emotions, I try and do so in italics or um, some sort of different font so that it's just like, well, this is just an expression. They're not negative emotion. They're human emotions that might be there for a very valid reason.
Mm.
So the anxiety might be trying to communicate something. The low mood might be trying to communicate something about a shift or an adjustment or a change of perspective or work that you might need to do. So the emotions in themselves aren't bad. They're not harmful. They're not going to damage you. They're part of your humanity. So my approach to work is that all of these parts get integrated so
Mm.
that if one comes up unexpectedly, if anxiety pops up, for example, that it doesn't be pushed down or abandoned or repressed, does that make sense?
It does. It's making me think of a line you said in a podcast I listened to. It was about shame.
I was talking to Fern Cotton, I think, about shame.
Yes,
And I think we were talking about that, yeah, the one place that shame can't survive is in light.
that's it. That's the one.
So
Yeah.
when so, and it's true, when you bring shame into light, I see it with clients all the time. The minute I mean, I'm smiling because, I think as a therapist, there's probably nothing I haven't heard at this stage.
I would
Particularly now
imagine.
that I'm older, I think I've probably heard most things, to be quite
Yeah.
honest, at this
But
stage.
the negative emotions that you were just referring to, they are often attached with shame, aren't they?
Oh, of course they are. I'm not, and most people have been given a message somewhere along the line that you should be happy, you shouldn't be anxious, you should be strong, particularly with men. I mean, if you look at the different kind of messages that men and women get in general,
Mm.
that there are differences, but actually they're harmful.
Mhm.
And particularly if we look at kind of alpha male cultures, where I know this conversation isn't new, but blokes believe that they have to be strong, they have to be resilient, they can't be upset. But how can that even be? Because we're all, all okay, there are obvious differences between male and female, but as human beings, there's not that much difference in terms of how we're made up psychologically.
Yeah.
We have emotions, we have feelings, we respond to the world, we respond to what's going on internally.
Mm.
So I guess rather than see them as negative, I try and say just try and see them as communicators, like signposts that are trying to work with you. So the emotions are trying to align with you,
Mm.
constantly kind of almost steer you back or level you out or get you to stop and reconsider or whatever the context may be. So, and that's hard work because if my culture, kind of Irish Catholic culture, it's all about being good and not complaining and be
Yeah.
grateful for what you've got and
Yeah.
all of that sort of stuff. So it's kind of like I never really felt I had room to complain about anything. So for me, I didn't like negative. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
talking.
it resonates with me too because my grandparents co-raised me and they were very, very strong Catholics, and there was
Ah,
a lot of stuff that I'm still working through now, to be honest,
well, that's a lifetime's work.
Yeah.
I've given up. I was laughing about this with someone the other day, actually, and
Yeah.
this is one of the great things about more experience and getting older. I've sort of given up on that notion of, having it all worked out. I think when I was younger and a bit more naive, I kind of thought there was a finite point of being sorted and having it all together. And
Yeah.
every time I got there, I think I was something else would come crashing in there. I think,
Yeah.
shit, I thought I had it all together. I thought it was pretty worked out, and now this has come up.
It's a good point.
And I think that's it. I think that's human struggle. That every time we think we've reached a new depth or a new understanding of something,
Mhm.
then if you believe in growth in whatever way you think about it, then it means that we're always going to be soul searching and digging deeper, not in a kind of ruminative, nasal gaping the whole time. I think
Yeah.
there's always work to be done, and we're always kind of on doing part
Well,
of self.
absolutely. And, this book, you've identified four key areas that most struggle, I think probably all struggle with: lack of self-worth, not feeling safe and secure, a sense of hopelessness, and questioning our lovability. And then obviously people can have that to various degrees. And then from there, then you go on to the book with how you can kind of work through that basically. Again, resonated a lot. And I was like, I can't imagine anybody doesn't have problems in this department. And like you said, it's maybe part of humanity and not time to self-diagnose.
I think so. And I was thinking about this recently, actually. I met someone a while back who did have an idyllic childhood, and it was genuinely idyllic.
Unicorn.
Yeah. Parents were incredible. I mean, it was just like, every aspect, it was kind of almost like it all happened very perfectly. And there was like no trauma, if I'm being really honest. There was nothing significant there at all. And it was just a very idyllic, happy, non-eventful. There wasn't a lot of negative experiences or interactions around. Now, the interesting thing is that this person really then started to struggle because their life suddenly then became troublesome and they had a few challenges to face, including an illness and dealing with some people at work. And the interesting thing was, even though you'd formulate, okay, not a lot of early adversity, what was kind of clear then as the work kind of developed and became bigger was actually because there was little adversity to be worked through. And because there was a very perfect model of how the family should be, and there was harmony at all cost, the difficulty was in for this person when they didn't experience harmony in life. And as we know, that's not always going to be the case. There will always be difficult people. There's always going to be difficult moments. Actually, their ability to cope with
Yeah.
the disharmony was really a challenge. So it's kind of like even in perfect stories, you get imperfection because, and then you meet people who have had the most awful times, and yet they really learn to develop resilience
Yeah.
and empathy and compassion and go out into the world and do incredible things. So it's just like there, I guess really my point is there isn't any perfect
Mm.
for anyone.
You've got what you've got, and I guess you've got to work with it. And
Yeah.
this is where, like, content like your books really, really helps. Actually, I was going to ask you about sort of patterns, especially, I suppose, the challenging ones. And actually, when we're talking about patterns, we could weave this also into the book of creating a pattern of doing some self therapy every day.
Yeah.
Something I wouldn't think of to necessarily do. And I guess you raised a really good point. I think it's in the book where you said about how we can go and see a therapist and nobody's taking away anything of doing that. But then, I mean, if you're lucky and you can afford to, because you're probably paying private, that's once a week. And for me, having done therapy myself, I have an hour and then I get on with my business, and I might remember some nuggets, but then by the time my next session comes around, I haven't really, there's been a bit of progression, I suppose. Life's gotten in the way. Whereas I think
Yeah.
with your book, when we go to the unhelpful patterns, by creating a new pattern every day, even for 10 minutes, it's kind of stopping those in their tracks.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's genuine good science behind this. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists often say that good therapy, 90% or approximately 90% of the work happens outside of session.
Uh-huh.
And I agree with that actually the real work, good therapy, I mean, certainly when I'm working with people, I'm always interested in what's going on for them between sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it just becomes about the work in session, then that's quite limited. Whereas actually, if day-to-day life, I'm always asking people to track the highs and lows and ups and downs, and or if a particular moment happens, to kind of stop and take a note, scribble a few notes about, okay, well, you may not be able to do it in the here and now, but that night, just scribble a few notes. Okay, what was going on for me? What was the thought interpretation? What were the emotions? How did I respond? What did I react? How did I look after myself? Was I attached to my story in that moment? So they then, I mean, literally, without sounding cliche, they're becoming their own therapist because they're beginning to spot their patterns and what their kind of typical responses are. Now, I guess for most people, what they discover is, I was talking to someone earlier actually, and we were having a conversation about, oh my God, this happens again and again and again, but in so many different contexts, these patterns of self-doubting. And I guess what you're trying to do from a more neuroscientific point of view is you're never actually going to change if you think of neural pathways going from A to B, you're never really going to undo that. But what you can do is you can lay over it.
Okay.
And the more you change your pattern and the more you change your behavior and you go the opposite direction from your normal default pattern, what you then end up doing is you end up building a new pathway that almost works. I describe it almost like a bypass or like a bridge. You're kind of almost taking a different route through.
Yeah.
So it means, the actual hardwired pathway is in place. So you're not replacing that or getting rid of it. There's no getting rid of it. But actually what you can do is you can learn to reinforce new patterns, new behaviors, new reactions, new responses. And what that doesn't time then it sends you reinform the mind. There's another way to respond. So that then becomes the new response and time that overlays. And then that becomes a default and a healthier response rather than just going back to doing what you've always done. And that's why the work between sessions is really important because that's the therapist can't follow you around for the week, but they can say, I need you to start becoming curious and observing what's happening for you and getting involved in recovery and breaking through rather than just expecting it all to be therapy.
Well, I interviewed Ellen Langer, mother of mindfulness, recently, and she was saying how most of us are mindless most of the time. So
Mm.
something like that, where it's every day, that actually stops us in our tracks from running on autopilot, because we can do that with work. I can do that on a phone conversation with my mum or whatever, but then like you don't think about the autopilot feelings you might be running on, and a lot of them are probably unpleasant. Certainly, people listening to this podcast, and you kind of
Absolutely.
accept it, or you take a medication for it, or you do whatever you can to self soothe. You just kind of feel like, well, this is how it is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I describe it somewhere in the book that even the section where it's the beginning of the day, I talk about, you wouldn't get into your car, at the beginning of the day without kind of checking your seatbelt, making sure your mirror is okay, locking the doors, all of the stuff that you do to start your car and drive off. There's pretty basic things that you need to do. Otherwise, the risk of you kind of crashing into a wall or having an accident are much higher.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of never understand why would we think it's okay to get up and crash land into our day and not stop to kind of, check in. Okay, where am I at today? Where's my head at? How am I feeling?
Yeah.
What might I need today? Am I overwhelmed? Do I need to make a few tweaks or adjustments to the day? Do I need a bit more support? Shall I take that out? Shall I put that in? Will I catch up with a mate later because I'm feeling a bit flat this morning? It just gives you that opportunity to kind of work out where you're at so that you can then make the necessary adjustments. I mean, I woke up the other day, I'm trying to think a few days ago, I woke up actually, and I wasn't planning to go for a run, and I had a really busy schedule. It was just one of the, how sometimes you get a day and it's just like literally back to back, and there was no breathing space, and it was bad planning on my part because something had been cancelled, and then I agreed to do it, and I shouldn't have done. I should have said no, but anyway, it was squeezed into the day, and I was trying to do a number of things, and I woke up and I was aware of how many things I had to do that day. And I had a few bits going on personally as well. And I wasn't planning to run. And I woke up and I knew I felt that immediate sense of, oh, this feels big today. It feels too big.
Mhm.
I didn't feel overwhelmed, but I was on the cusp of, I was aware that I was kind of elevated more than I wanted to be. And I kind of thought, all right, well, I'm up. What I'm doing at 9 o'clock, I can push back for a half an hour. And so I kind of got up and my other half took the dog and I went for a run. And it was just stopping for a few minutes I mean, I argue you got to practice what you preach, otherwise you can't do this work.
Sure.
So it was kind of that stopping to acknowledge, okay, I'm feeling it today. And one, I've badly planned. Secondly, it is a bit overwhelming. It's too much. So it kind of like, okay, I need to make a tweak. So I had to push something back, got up, went for a run, did a bit more meditation when I come back. And I was good as gold. It was absolutely fine. But I
Yeah.
think if I had to just railroaded through and got on with it, then I think the day would have became sticky, and I think it just would have been a more difficult day to manage. So I think the whole time we're kind of making these self-observations so that we kind of become aware of what we may need, because the landscape can change. I mean, that is the thing about being a human being.
Mm.
Sometimes our mood can change, or the level of overwhelm can increase, or someone's behavior might change, or something might happen that we weren't expecting. So, like, none of us really get up and have a clear trajectory of how the day is going to be. We're all constantly battling, not knowing what's going on in the internal world or what's happening in the external world. So, we like every day is a blank canvas of like no idea what's
Yeah.
coming today.
Yeah.
But being ready for that and being flexible enough to respond accordingly, I think is that, I mean, for me, that's good mental well-being.
And being flexible with your like perception as well, isn't it? Because I think even a perception shift can just transform
Of
thoughts
course,
and feelings.
of course it can. Well, a belief that it's got to be perfect, or I need to be perfect, or today needs to go well. No, today just needs to be what it's going to be.
Mm,
And if you show up and do your best and you show up as honestly as you can, then that's all it can be. Whereas actually, we often create these ideas. I mean, I could come onto this podcast today and have a whole load of notions about how it's going to be and how it should be and how
yeah.
I need to be. And, like thankfully I don't do that, but if I did, or if the old perfectionist in me did that, I mean, I would be absolutely on the ceiling with anxiety before I did any events, whereas I've got much more skilled and open to the fact that you show up, you do your job, you do it well, you're as honest as you can be, you speak truthfully about the work and you stay present, then that's all it needs to be, because everything else will flow well.
Yeah.
I think that's a much more natural way of approaching it, and it's a much easier way. It takes the burden away from it all.
Well, I'm smiling because I've asked hardly any of the questions I had. I mean, but I knew it was going to be a great conversation anyway. But
Can I mention one thing actually, because I'm just
yeah.
thinking it may be helpful, and it's going to sound like a hard plug, but it's actually not. But I'm for anyone who's struggling with anxiety, particularly, I get most messages on Instagram about anxiety, and I really noticed that most anyway, even on LinkedIn and stuff, if I'm going to get messages from people, it's always about anxiety. And I'm doing this course at the minute online. The details are on my website, or if you go to
Yeah. It's a life less anxious. That one.
on the Life Less Anxious, and I'm actually going to do a free seminar coming up on it, because there's just so many people, kind of wanting to do it. And I kind of think some people, I mean, it's not that expensive at all, but if even people who can't afford to do it, I want to do a one-off free seminar so people can just come and get a sense and give some takeaway. I haven't got the date yet, but you can register on my website for that, which is owenokane.com. And you get a freebie. Just come along and I'll give as many tips as I can. And then if anyone wants to do it's a live 6-week program. I did them last year. They were absolutely, I mean, I loved every millisecond of them, because it just attracted a really nice bunch of people. And it's a 6-week program, live every week for 6 weeks. And I cover a different aspect of anxiety. And a very fresh take on anxiety. It's not the kind of old traditional
Even the
method.
word anxiety now, I feel, is quite loaded.
Yeah, it can be.
It's big, isn't it? And there's so much in it.
It captures a lot, but this is really about empowering people. My take on anxiety does not have to be a negative, terrible experience. Anxiety is working with you. It's not working against you. But if you turn it into an enemy and you turn it into a problem, then that's exactly what it becomes. When actually, if you can see your anxiety as an ally and something that's working for you, but it's just highly exaggerated and working way too hard, you can reshape your entire relationship with it. So I just wanted to message that, particularly for anybody who struggles with anxiety. The details are on my website, but have a look.
We'll put all that in the show notes as
Thank
well.
you. Hard plug over, but thank you.
No, that was definitely, I can't let you go without asking the Happier Life Project's last 5 and 5, because this is our signature sign off, Owen, and it's the same 5 questions I ask every guest. But because when we spoke in season 1, it was called My Possible Self, we hadn't done the last 5 and 5. So, but don't worry, they are quick fire. But I also feel like it would be super, super helpful if we could kind of surmise in terms of, and I hate the top tips or whatever, but like linking it back to how to be your own therapist and everything we've talked about today. What are maybe 3 of your personal favorite, whether that's questions to ask yourself, self-reflections, or maybe quick exercises that we can...
If I think about my work, okay, you can do the best therapy in the world, and you can do the best courses in the world and give talks and all of that stuff, and people can take away a load of information. But I guess in my experience, there are a few things that I think if you don't include these, then all of the techniques in the world are meaningless unless these are included. And I think for me, they are. The first thing has to be, you alluded to it earlier and you mentioned it, that unless you're willing to talk to yourself and treat yourself as someone who matters, then the rest of the work becomes meaningless, because that is the crux of all of this work, that it's unapologetically, even though you may not feel it and you might have this critical voice that's spewing out stuff, there has to be the ability to talk to yourself and treat yourself as someone who matters. And I think for most people, if they get that, then they're halfway there. Because it's a really solid platform to work from. I think the second thing I would mention is that I think we live in a world that's become increasingly complicated. I think opting for simplicity when you can is hugely, hugely, hugely underrated. Whereas actually, the stuff in your life that feels simple but actually brings pleasure, it could be, I don't know, taking the dog for a walk, or I go for a walk down the river every evening where I live, and I put a podcast on, or I meditate, or whatever I do. And honestly, it's the best hour of my day. and it costs nothing. And I really believe more and more and more that opting in for simplicity and seeking out simplicity is a hugely, hugely important tip or technique, call it whatever you want, for better mental well-being. And I think the most important thing, and this is not new, but I think it's often missed or not talked about, that I think in a lot of mental health challenges, or a lot of human challenges as we're calling them, that loneliness and isolation is often a massive part of that. And like, for example, people who are depressed, the one symptom that's never mentioned in any of the criterias or tick boxes or assessments, no one ever asked about loneliness. And yet I've never worked with anyone in my entire career who was struggling with depression who hasn't described loneliness. And yet we never talk about it as a symptom. And I think very often with human struggle comes loneliness, because the human ego will do all it can to portray an image to the world that everything's good, I'm fine. But in doing that, what we do is we shut down and we isolate. So I guess my third really important tip is connect as much as you can.
And I suppose to go full circle to conclude our chat, that brings it back to sharing your story and the power of your story, doesn't it? Because it's not just sharing it with yourself, it's sharing it with others.
You're sharing it with someone else, and unapologetically. Because I think if you apologize for your story, or if you're tentative or you're dismissive or you're ashamed of your story, then you become a victim of your story. Whereas I think regardless of what your story has been, whatever's happened, whatever you've been through, always unapologetically tell your story. And the fact that you've survived and the fact that you've come through and you're out the other end and you're working at rebuilding your life, there's the power and there's the strength, and you should never, ever dim that or keep that hidden. Now, I always appreciate there's parts of story that you may not want that to be public information, and you may not want that out there. But I just kind of think never ever be ashamed of your story. You can be selective in who you share your story with, but never be ashamed of your story, because if you are ashamed of your story, then that's what you'll stay attached to. Or actually, if you can celebrate your story, even in all its rawness and the tough bits and the darker bits, if you can celebrate it, then it becomes something different, because then you're empowered, and your story can then be your salvation and your breakthrough, rather the thing that keeps you stuck.
And I loved, just to piggyback off that, you also said, well, there was two favourite lines I had. Everybody, including you, is born good enough.
I believe that. Sorry for me slurping my drink there as you had that golden moment.
No.
It's the heat.
And you also said in the book, people don't treat themselves well. It's the crux of human struggle.
Yeah.
Just those two things I'd highlighted.
Yeah. And I think that is the essence of this entire conversation. You know, I think so much content out there is about, you need to be more this, you need to be less that, you need to do this, you need to do that. You know, we're just bombarded. I get confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a therapist. I've been around a long time. I sometimes get confused by some of the information out there and some of the science. And, you know, there are experts everywhere telling us how to live. And that is the world we live in. I mean, and here I am talking about my work and what I do. So I'm one of those people talking about what I think helps people's lives. So I'm going to sound like a hypocrite, but I do think it's often about coming back to knowing who you are, knowing what goes on within you, and being brave enough to truthfully look at how you deal with yourself and how you treat yourself. Because there within, for most people, honestly, there's where the real difficulty is for most people. And I think if we focus more on that and talk more about that there, then what you'd find is a lot of people's symptoms would drop off considerably. I really believe that.
Well, I cannot recommend people getting How to Be Your Own Therapist if they don't already have it. 7th of October is the course, A Life Less Anxious. OwenO'Kane.com for the website.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got to do the Happier Life Project /5 and 5. Are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. When and where are you at your happiest?
At the moment, when I walk along the river close to where I live, particularly at nighttime, early evening, nighttime, when there's few people around, it's quiet, there's space, and it really helps me center.
What's your favorite thing to do that nourishes your mental health?
Running.
What piece of advice do you now know that you wished somebody would have told you earlier that would have made you a happier person?
That you can't live life trying to please people all of the time or be what you think you need to be for them. You have to find your own identity and who you are.
What is the most important one thing that needs to change to make the world a happier place?
The one thing that needs to change. God, there's so many. I mean, where do we begin? Here's my thoughts on this. I truly believe that we're all very lucky to be here, and none of us own anything. We come here, we go, we're passing through. And I don't believe any of us have any right to territorially claim any of this as our own, because we're here, we're guests here, we're born, we die, we pass through. And I think that if we lived that way, and regardless of what your political beliefs are, what your social beliefs are, wherever in the world you are, I think if we all accepted that none of us really have a right to claim ownership of any of this here, that we're just human beings passing through and just living and respecting each other, then I think, well, of course, how would we have wars if we don't have the claim and the right to territory? And if we respected each other's rights to be here, well, then we wouldn't have the problems we have. So I think that would be the one thing. Why don't we just all acknowledge and accept that none of it's ours? We don't own a single thing. That's a bit deep. I don't know where that came from.
I mean, yeah, I agree. If only we had a magic wand, then the environment would be a lot better off as well.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's throwing you, hasn't it? It's throwing me. I don't know where it came from.
You were channeling there.
Channeling something, God knows what. We'll blame the heat.
Okay, last question. What is a simple, actionable first step we can take when it comes to becoming our own therapist that will help us on our journey to building a happier life?
Stop and take a look inside and don't run from it. We all want the external world to make us better.
Yeah.
We all think that when we get that, achieve that, do that, he does that, she does that, when I get there. That's the human story. We're external, we externalize everything with the belief that that's what's going to solve the inside stuff, when actually stopping to look inside and be willing to work with that stuff. That's, in my experience, that's the way through.
Drops mic. It's been such a joy to
thank you. I hope
with you and have this conversation.
Thank you. Hopefully we landed where we needed to.
Yeah, I think we did. Thanks again.
No worries.
No, thanks again to Owen O'Kane. It really was fantastic to have another sit down with Owen, and hopefully we won't have to wait another 3 years for the next one. And thank you to you, my friend, for listening to this very episode of the Happier Life Project podcast with me, Gabby Sanderson. Now, just one more minute of your time, please, for the important housekeeping. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download and access all of the content, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you are in crisis or you think you may have an emergency, please do call your doctor or the emergency services immediately. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the interviewer, which is me, and the interviewees. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a substitute for professional or medical advice. Our partners at the Priory Healthcare are not involved in the production or content of this podcast. Please do subscribe and leave a review if you found this episode helpful and you are listening to it on one of the podcast platforms. And to find and follow us on social media, if you're not already there, we're most active on Instagram and we're at My Possible Self, and I've been at Radio Gabby. Do take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.